a somewhat inspirational start to your meetings. Sometimes when you're doing this, you ask bow your heads, but today I'm going to ask you just to be looking at each other. When I was asked to come and talk about discrimination and inclusion, I thought, why are they asking me? And then I went, oh, yeah, okay. But when I thought about what I wanted to say, Susie had put together a wonderful presentation, but I thought, that's not me. So what I wanted to say, don't worry, it's okay, Susie. If there was ever a group that we do not need to talk about discrimination or, what's that word? Inclusion, it's this group. When you become a realtor, you know you're going to be working with everyone. And if you discriminate, you will no longer be in business. You know that whoever walks through that door, black, white, Asian, gay, whatever it might be, you're going to help them. So that's why I think this group's job should be, if you see discrimination, and if you see people not being included, it's your job to reach out to them. It's very, very important that we remember everyone is the same. I'm the same as you. My lifestyle is a little bit different, but you've all loved me for a long time, and I've loved all of you. So please, if you see that happening, be the realtors I know you are. Reach out. Thank you very much. You could stand. You okay, Susie?
Good.
And join with me. I
pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you very much, Leanne. Thanks to our affiliate sponsors, one lucky door prize winner will receive a $100 gift certificate to Prime 82 before we leave today. You all received a ticket when you came in. Don't lose your ticket. Find a ticket on the floor. Now you have 2 chances. And thanks to a grant from the National Association of Realtors, one lucky e-card realtor will win free local dues next year, to be drawn next week at the board meeting. As Leanne, I think, was supposed to mention earlier, but you covered it, we are here today to take a more active role in making our community stronger. Master storyteller Bridget Brown will set the tone for a discussion about building personal wealth and eliminating racial gaps in home ownership with her enlightening introduction to unconscious bias, followed by Antoine Thompson, who will share the National Association of Real Estate Brokers report on the state of housing in Black America. And finally, Asian Real Estate Association of America President Tom Trong will present some statistics about Asian Americans and Pacific Islander community and how we as a community can all come together to provide fair housing opportunities for all. We would have liked to include speakers from the Hispanic real estate professionals, the Women's Council of Real Estate, Veterans Affairs, but our time is limited. So my goal here today, and it's our goal really, is to leave with a little bit more knowledge and energized about our efforts to facilitate fair housing and home ownership for everyone. So we have something a little special to kick things off. Could you please welcome the YPN members for me, Tia McCloskey, Keith Turner, Marco Tristan, and Akila Snyder to the stage, please.
Are you offended when people ask, what are you? I get that every day. Unconscious bias or racism. My boss asked me to drop off some leftover flyers
biased or sexist?
I was riding home and prepared to put 20% down when the loan officer asked me what my salary was. He was basically surprised when I told him I was making 6 figures. I'm a single woman, unconscious, biased, or sexist.
As an African-American attorney, I walked into a room before the closing, and the client asked, when is the attorney coming? Am I just biased or racist?
A gentleman walked into our house, and the male realtor showing him the house repeatedly referenced his wife. When your wife is here, when your wife sees this, etc. Finally, I said, I don't have a wife. I'm gay. Unconscious bias or stereotype?
Not only am I pretty young and smart, I close loans as well. Conscious bias or sexist?
I look younger than I am. After submitting an offer for my client, the listing agent called me to ask me if I knew I was. I felt like I wasn't taken seriously. Unconscious bias or discrimination.
I am a landlord. I recently denied a veteran because they had tattoos and probably have that PTSD thing. Unconscious bias or discrimination.
I went to a listing appointment and brought him on point. After that appointment, which I thought went very well, the homeowner said to me, I'm never going to list my home with your kind. I am a minority. Unconscious bias or bigotry?
An old friend of mine walked into my office to apply for a loan. I was uncomfortable asking that person which gender they identified themselves with. I want to learn how to ask that question.
Thank you guys very much. I'd like to welcome Bridget Brown to the stage. Bridget K. Brown is a public speaking, storytelling coach and a master facilitator who specializes in making the complex, clear, and coaching stories out of her people. The powerful ones that uplift others can create connections, and the hidden ones that create disconnection and inequality. Bridget has worked for 3 different Fortune 500 companies, including Monsanto and a small beer company called Anheuser-Busch. She is trained at the Alan Alda Center for Communicating Science at Stony Brook University. She's a former adjunct instructor in the School of Engineering and Applied Science at Washington University in St. Louis, where she taught public speaking, and she's coached 3 TEDx talks. She is one of a team of diversity trainers, for the state of Connecticut, and her passion for equality keeps showing up in the 5 plays and screenplays she has authored. Her superpower is coaching stories out of people, especially the ones that they didn't know that they could tell, or the ones they didn't know they had. Bridget, all yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning.
Good
I'm
morning.
so excited to be here today, and I really want to thank everyone who came today, and especially Susie. Can we have a round of applause for Susie? This is Last Saturday, I was having breakfast with a friend, and I told her that I was going to be here today, that I was doing this speech and a workshop afterwards in this topic about unconscious bias. And she told me the following story. She had about 8 or 10 people over to her house for a business event. Half the people were African American, excuse me, and half the people were white. And as they got talking around the table about various topics, including politics, the subject of race came up, and she found herself saying something to the effect of the following. Well, I think that there's racism in both the white community and the black community, especially in the way in which most blacks are so economically challenged that they must feel racism against. And she stopped herself and thought, I don't even know what I'm saying. And then later in the evening, at that point that actually she stopped herself, there was an African-American gentleman at the table who mercifully said to her, I think I know what you're saying, and moved the conversation along. Well, my friend was mortified. She is white, I failed to mention that, as is her husband. And she later went up to this African-American gentleman and she said, I'm so sorry, I it didn't come out right, what I wanted to say. I just always worry because most blacks are so economically challenged, and he stopped her and he said, "That's not my experience. Yes, I grew up in a predominantly black neighborhood, but I had 2 parents. We were a middle-class family, and we went to a good public school and got a good education, and everybody in the neighborhood, they also had 2 parents, and they went to the same public school, and we all went on to college." And my friend was dumbfounded. And as she sat there, almost in tears, at the table with me, she said, "I don't know where this came from. Where did this idea come from? Of course I know that there are African Americans in this country who are middle class, who are upper middle class, who are upper class just as much as there are whites who are really poor. I don't know where this came from." Dr. Jennifer Everhart defines unconscious bias as the beliefs and feelings we have about social groups that can influence decision-making and our behavior, even when we're not aware of it. Dr. Everhart is a social psychologist at Stanford University, and she coaches and teaches a lot of police officers throughout the country in this concept of unconscious bias. And the piece of this, and just full disclosure, we're going to have a little bit of problems with the formatting up here, so there may be some text you won't see. But she coaches and teaches, as I said, and the piece of this that's important is can influence decision-making and our behavior, even when we're not aware of it. Now, by show of hands, if there is anyone in this room who is not human, could you please raise your hand? Anybody? I got a couple of people over here who aren't responding at all, so I don't know if that means, I don't know what that means. Anybody? Anybody else who's not human? Do we have anybody from a planet that's not Earth? Okay. So the other thing that Dr. Everhart talks about in her book, and again, this is a formatting issue. So there is a difference between unconscious bias and racism. And there are different forms of racism, but that's not what we're talking about today. And you can think of it as sort of a spectrum disorder, okay? Because the thing about unconscious bias is that unconscious bias comes from some sort of lack of knowledge. It comes from something that you learned, but you didn't learn it quite properly. There's all different places that unconscious bias comes from. Racism has pattern and intent. Pattern and intent. Okay? It doesn't matter the color of your skin, you will have unconscious bias. It doesn't matter your gender identification, you will have unconscious bias. But here's where it gets really tricky. So, even those with unconscious bias can say or do something that is racist. And those who they say or do something to, it can be received as racist from the point of view of the person who's receiving it. So let me say this again, because this is really important. You are human. You have unconscious biases. And sometimes those biases, like with my friend, come out, and the thing that they say can be perceived as racist by the person who's receiving it. That doesn't mean you're racist, as Dr. Everhart explains in her book. So, here's why this happens. You don't control your thoughts. Is there anyone in here who believes that they control every thought that goes through their head? Okay, good, because we'd have to go down another zone and I don't think that's much time. All right? You don't control your thoughts, but you do control what you do with them. And sometimes it's just a matter of slowing yourself down. So, all of these stories that we heard up here, with a couple of exceptions in my personal opinion, are are called microaggressions. And this is part of the way that unconscious bias comes out. A microaggression is a statement, action, or incident regarded as indirect, subtle, or unintentional discrimination against members of a racial or ethnic or other minority. So that's how they come out. So to put it another way, it's the judgy. It's the judgy. You walk into a grocery store and you see a woman yelling at her children in Spanish, and you think, those people. You see a person on a scooter who is extremely obese, and the reason they're on the scooter is they literally can't walk, and you think, why can't we just go on a diet? Whatever that story is that comes up, that's where your unconscious bias lies. See, we don't do unconscious bias like, well, I think that all African Americans grow up poor. That's not the thought in our head. The thought is the thing that my friend said at the dinner. That then as she said it, she thought, what story am I telling here? The thought is the thing about the person on the scooter that is about them going on the diet. But let me tell you something. Somebody who weighs 600 pounds, they got a lot of stuff going on. It's not just because they ate too much cake or they should go on the diet. There's a lot of emotional stuff going on, and chances are about 80 to 90% they were sexually abused. So it's the stories, it's the shoulds. They should be another way. She should do this. That's where the bias, that's the key. That's the key that unlocks the door that gets to the bias that's underneath. So when you hear yourself saying those things, that's when you need to stop. So where does this unconscious bias come from? Well, we have to dig into our own pasts. And not just our individual pasts, but the pasts of this country. The history of slavery and racism in this country. American history, the history of our families. Maybe it was somebody in your family who scolded you when you gained 10 pounds. I got what I still to this day call the Patsy talk when I was about 10 years old, because we had a family friend who was overweight, so my parents sat me down and said, you don't want to be like Patsy. Yeah, I've had a weight issue my entire life. Thank you, Mom and Dad. But that's what happens, right? We get told something that you don't want to be like those people, or you don't want to be this, or you don't want to be that, and it passes down through our family. Your religion, your church, the church that you went to when you grew up, and the church that you go to now. There's some statistics on the table, and you will see in the state of Connecticut, we are 81.6% white at this particular moment in time. And that being the case, the chances are the places in which you worship and you send your kids to school pretty much look a lot like you. So how do you learn about people of other cultures? The media of your time. I was just listening to a podcast yesterday with some gentlemen who were gay, and they were talking about when was it that they saw representation of themselves in the media, and how that was a pivotal moment in their life. And if you were white in this room, you saw representation all your life. But if you're African American, Asian, or some combination, or you're of a different gender identity in this room, it took a really long time before you started seeing that. And there are more changes coming. But all of these things come in to us, and we don't even notice that they're coming in. We may be watching something, and at the exact moment we're watching it, we think, no, I don't know if that's true, but it's still landed. So, here's what we've got. We're human. Because we're human, we have unconscious biases. We got these biases from someplace that we may need to examine. Now the question becomes, what do we do? Dr. Eberhardt defines cultural competency as how we manage bias and the tools for managing it, and how we get around it. Because see, Dr. Eberhardt knows that because of the fact that we are human, and because of the fact that we are human and we have biases, we have to do what we can to get around it. And that's cultural competency. So it's about questioning your thoughts. It's about questioning your judging. I really want a bumper sticker now that says don't do judging. I don't understand it. And then questioning it again. So that when you hear it come up about the woman on the scooter who should lose weight, say, is that really what's going on? When you are at a dinner and you have somebody like my friend who says this thing, ask the question, is that really true? Can you know for sure that that's true? And own your own stuff, people. I'm really actually proud of my friend because she owned it. She said, I don't know where this came from, but I have to think on this because this is not who I want to be. This is not the person I want to be. And she asked me, are you racist? Am I racist? And I said to her, I pointed out to her that the chances are high that she's not because she invited 4 or 5 African Americans over for dinner. And I may be biased, but I'm thinking if she was outright racist, that wouldn't have happened. But she owned her own stuff. And you have to own your own privilege. We all have privilege of different kinds. If we are white, we have a privilege that's different than economic privilege, and lots of times economic privilege is added into that. Be aware of it. You don't have to feel bad about it, but just know that you've been granted something that not everybody in our society is granted. And the reason that I'm really proud of my friend is that she owned her own crap. She owned her own story. And this is a Brene Brown quote. Owning our story and loving ourselves through the process is the bravest thing we'll ever do. As she was sitting there at breakfast, she was crying. And she said, I needed to tell this to someone, but I was afraid to tell you this because I was afraid you wouldn't like me. And I said to her, I think you're brave. It's really, in effect, about empathy. A few years back, I was living in St. Louis, Missouri, and I was going through a really, really tough time of grief in my life. And I was part of a social group, and there was an event at a friend's house, and I felt like one of those things, I have to at least stop by. And I didn't want to go, because the event was at this home of somebody who reminded me of the grief that I was going through. But I just felt like I had to. So I walk in like a bull in a china shop. And I go up to my friend to say, hello, how are you, how have you been? And at the moment that I go up to her, she is sitting and talking to a woman who is African American. My friend was actually Middle Eastern. But she's sitting talking to a woman who's African American. And my friend starts talking to me, we go into the house, we start talking to her husband. I turn around to leave, because again, I can only be here for a second, but I had to stop and say hello, that type of thing. And the African American woman stopped me. And she said, you were rude. You were rude to me. I was talking to Jen Ann, and you didn't even say excuse me, and you just took over the conversation. When someone tells you how they feel about how they've been treated, recognize their truth. That was true for her. And listen to what they're saying. Stay non-judgmental. Because as she said that to me, as she said to me, you were rude, I saw on her face, this is what she felt. Not only that I was rude, but here this white woman walked in, didn't even see her, didn't even acknowledge her, as if she wasn't a person, and took over the conversation. I saw that on her face, and I realized, you know what? She was right. And she wasn't right because she was black. She was right because I was in my own stuff. I was so in my own stuff. I was so filled with grief and other stuff about coming over that day that it didn't matter who was sitting there. And so I apologized to the woman. And I said to her, I am so sorry. You didn't deserve that. I was just so excited to see Jen Ann, and you didn't deserve the way that I treated you. And her face changed, and suddenly she saw the pain on my face. Because I said back to her I repeated back to her that I heard how she felt. So, the last thing is to challenge it when you hear it. Another quick story. A neighbor came over to help me with a door. He was white. And he said to me, and I'm going to say a bad word here, folks. He said to me, somebody niggered this door really badly. And I stopped, and I said, I used something that a friend had taught me. I said, oh, it's so interesting that you would say that, especially since my mother is black. Which is true, by the way, my mother was mixed race. And he froze. And later he apologized to me, and I said, first of all, you're not welcome in my home if you're going to use that language. And secondly, your teenage son was standing there. Is this really what you want to teach him? Challenge him. In the workshop this afternoon, we're going to give you some tools for actually challenging it in a way that is kind. Because again, shaming people who have these unconscious biases doesn't help. That African American gentleman who told the truth, who told his story to my friend, he didn't shame her. That was what was truth for her in that moment, in some shape or form. The simple act of naming a bias as such or objecting to it on the spot establishes a social atmosphere that discourages it. Saying nothing serves to condone it. Daniel Goleman from Emotional Intelligence. I am convinced, the more that I study this work, that we're not going to solve the problems that we have in the United States of America through national conversations. We're going to solve it through conversations like this. We're going to solve it by people in this association hearing some of those things that we're told up here, some of those microaggressions. Those are true stories, by the way, in case you didn't know that. Those are all true stories that happen to people in this association. And we're going to only solve it by people in this association kindly challenging their colleagues, kindly challenging their friends. And by the way, the one about the wearing the pants and as opposed to a dress, so just take a look, because you don't get that off. I just want to make clear, okay? And I'm rocking. Listen, folks, let's review. You're human. You have unconscious biases because you're human. That doesn't make you racist. But sometimes the stuff you say sounds a little, yeah. And cultural competency means that you're going to do your best to slow down and think about it and figure out where the judge is coming from. And because you're human, you're going to make mistakes. You're still going to say the thing that just is, or you're going to have a situation like I had, which had nothing to do with race, but it was you being so intense on something and the person standing next to you perceived it as a misogynist or homophobic or racial slight because of their point of view. And all of those things can be true at the same time. Lastly, if you're sitting there being judgy about my friend, who honestly had no intent in this situation, but discovered this story that she was telling, this story that created disconnection, I want you to listen to the story a different way. So my friend's sitting at dinner, and she comes out with this phrase how she thinks that all blacks are poor and that they must hate whites because they're poor. And And then a gentleman at the table who is African American says, that's not my experience of it. I grew up in a middle class home. And my friend says, yeah, sure you did. Would you like some coffee? Which one of them do you want sitting behind a loan officer's desk? The person who made the honest mistake and tried to figure out why? Or the person who didn't listen to the truth of the person sitting next to them? Thank you.